This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome into the podcast, friends. I am Pastor Randy Moore. I am the associate pastor at Methodist Temple, United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. And as always, I'm joined by the lead pastor, the senior pastor here at Methodist Temple, Pastor Andy Payton. It is Tuesday, Pastor Andy, and churches sometimes fill in with the electoral process. And so when I pulled up today, I noticed that the only day of the year, or maybe one of only 2 days of the year because of the primary election, are you going to see campaign signs on a church lawn?
Yep. When you pulled in this morning, it was like, oh, yeah, it's election day. So,
right.
And it's good to be with you too, Pastor Andy, by the way.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right into it. We are in this sermon series on the stained glass windows at Methodist Temple. Now, if you go to Methodist Temple, and I'm not going to assume that's everybody who's listening, we hope that there are those who are joining us who have never been here. But I'm sure, like me, and maybe even like you, Pastor Andy, you probably spent more time, especially that you're preparing this sermon series, but it's something that you have to pause for, right? You can enjoy the windows as the windows and see the colors and the light coming through them without ever pausing to take a look. But every one of them has a story to tell.
Oh, definitely. Every window is like its own little sermon in and of itself in a artistic kind of way. And every time I've preached one of these sermons, it's been really good just to sit and contemplate the window, its meaning, what is the message it's trying to convey. I also have to say there's some components to the windows. I'm like, what is that? What does that mean? The one that's coming up this weekend, there's actually like a bee buzzing in the window. I'm like, what's the bee there for? But
maybe honey.
I don't know. Maybe it's sweet. I don't know. But I don't know what it's doing for me, and I think what it's doing for some of the folks that are going through the series with us is that it helps to create more of a sense of sacred space with our sanctuary, and so it's a series, but then it also kind of helps us to prepare and appreciate our sacred space in which we worship too.
Yeah, not to put you on the spot, but what do you know about the history of it and why they chose, way back in the day, what was it, like middle 1950s, why they chose those particular stained glass windows, and were they custom? Was there an artist that was commissioned, or these were just off the shelf? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can tell you this, I've been in a lot of churches throughout my life, and every one of them has stained glass windows, and a lot of them do, and they always seem to be unique. And I'm thinking probably these are one of a kind, and the way we got them is, if you look at it, they're always commissioned by someone. So someone gave it in memory of someone else, and so there's a window that tells a story. Then there's a person that gave the window, and I'm wondering. Always, every time I look at those names, I'm like, what's the story behind that story? Who are these people that came before us? And what a wonderful gift that they gave us in these windows that depict the Beatitudes, but then we go on into the parables of Jesus. And so I guess my answer to your question is, I don't know, Randy. I've read all the information I can find. I can't really get the story that you're asking about, but they're these windows, they're a real treasure, though.
They really are. Okay, let's jump into it. We are up to verse 6 in the 5th chapter of Matthew. Of course, this is Jesus' opener in the Sermon on the Mount. So that covers chapters 5 through 7 in the Gospel of Matthew. Of course, we don't have to think that Jesus delivered this sermon all at once. This was Matthew's way of collecting all of these sayings of Jesus and these teachings of Jesus and then placing them on the mountain, and that would recall Moses. And so there was a purpose for the way that Matthew put this together. And it begins with the Beatitudes. And so we might want to start, for those who might be joining us for the first time on this, Pastor Andy, and define what a beatitude is. It's not a word we use in everyday language.
No. What they describe is the dispositions that Jesus hopes that people have within their hearts as his followers. And so it's much more than just an external type of thing that we do. The Beatitudes are like the internal, the heart of what Jesus hopes to convey and what he hopes his followers will be able to cultivate within their lives. And so as he sits down in Moses-type fashion here, rather than like 10 commandments, he's given us 10 dispositions. This is the attitude of the heart that I'm looking for, and this is what I want from people, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a little bit lengthy, but I think it makes sense to read it because in one sense, they have a message of their own, but in another sense, they just have one message all together. So let me read it, and just so folks get the full flavor of it. Again, it's Matthew 5, 1 through 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Well, there it is.
Those are the Beatitudes.
Yep. And this week we're focusing on one particular stained glass window in the sanctuary, the one that says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled."
Yep.
It's interesting, before we jump into looking at your sermon and reflecting on it, it's interesting that Luke also has a sermon. His sermon is on the plain, right? It's on a flat surface, and it's not 9 Beatitudes, it's 4 Beatitudes and 4 woes, and he has this one. He has this one, but it's just blessed are those who are hungry. And so there's been that debate that, Luke was more about someone's actual physical need, where Matthew spiritualized it, but I don't necessarily think we have to say that about Luke. Luke could have that, he could have had in mind the same thing that Matthew had in mind by saying, blessed are the hungry. May have run the whole gamut of how you define hungry. Mm-hmm. Could be, hunger for food or hunger for righteousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, the two go together. Like Matthew obviously is more about the internal disposition, and Luke is talking about more like the external. I think he is kind of talking about the external, but really, if you get the right disposition in your heart, it's going to lead to action, right? I mean, so you can't just separate them. I think I agree, Randy. They're kind of conveying the same message, just in their own ways.
Yeah. Okay, in your sermon today, or last Sunday, and this is our practice here with the podcast, is to go ahead and reflect on it and dig a little bit deeper, not to re-preach the sermon, but as a way to return to it, so that the message that comes through it, and we're listening for the Word of God every time, right? In a sermon, or when we're studying the Bible, we're listening for the Word of God, that it might be something that takes hold in our spirits and in our hearts, and then actually takes hold in our lives. But you opened with a story about the fact that you did a graduation ceremony at the University of Evansville.
Mm-hmm. Yep. One of the things I do in our community beyond Methodist Temple is I serve as the part-time chaplain at the University of Evansville. It's a real honor because, of course, UE has a long history with the United Methodist Church, and because I'm a United Methodist pastor, they asked me to come along.
And you're next door.
And I'm right next door. I literally walk across the street when we have meetings over there. But so they have a spring athletic commencement for the athletes who are going to graduate but can't make it to the regular graduation. And in my sermon on Sunday, I kind of joke, but I'm kind of serious too. I really like the athletic commencement because it's, number one, it's shorter. And then it's more intimate, right? I
Sure.
mean, you're right there. People are right there and you're together. But so I went to the commencement. I heard a couple really heartfelt speeches. The students, they've gone across the stage and they've graduated now. And then Pres P looks at me and says, now Reverend Payton's going to come and give the benediction. Well, here's the thing about me and UE. I always give them some script, and then I almost always go off the script when I get, I'm sure they just love that in the university. But as I walk up to the podium, the words of Thomas Merton comes to my mind. And Merton, of course, is a monk, lived in Gethsemane, Kentucky. Some would say he's one of the greatest spiritual leaders of the 20th century. I would argue probably so.
Mm-hmm.
But when he talked about the spiritual journey, what Merton said was, it's about becoming who we already are. And that's just, to me, that's perfect. Mm-hmm. Anyway, walk up to the podium and I look out the graduates and I say, receive these words from Thomas Merton, become who you already are. You're gifted, you're brave, you're beloved. Beloved by your friends, your family, but above all, God. And now what was interesting about that was it's just a benediction, like benedictions I give every week, right?
Almost a beatitude.
Almost a beatitude, I guess you could say. Yep. But afterward, people came up to me and was like, thank you for those words. I needed to hear that. I needed that challenge. I needed that affirmation in my life. And the pastor and me began to ponder, of course, like, isn't that interesting? Because most of the time people don't respond to benedictions like that. And it seemed like it hit a chord, and it hit something that deeply we need to know, we need to hear, we long for.
Yeah, and Merton can pack a lot into a few words, and he certainly does right here. Such an important message to remember, because when we go back and we look back, we tend to, and a lot of this comes out of the Protestant tradition, of course, but we look back to how sinful we are. And, we might be saved and we might be on the path to sanctification, but somehow we think the beginning started in sin when actually it started in this who we are in God, in the image of God.
We talk about original blessing versus original sin.
Yeah. And
if you look at Genesis, original blessing comes first. Chapter 1, God creates. And at the end, God says it's very good. And that does include humanity. And that's really what Merton is starting with. He's like, hey, look, you're a child of God. That's who you are. Sin is like, it blocks that. It mars that. It keeps us from seeing that. And really what the journey is about is going back before all that stuff happened and beginning to see who we already deeply are, which is, to the Beatitude, I think what righteousness is about. Righteousness, another Beatitude, another way I've heard it translated is by Eugene Peterson in The Message. He says, righteousness is about hungering and thirsting for God. And so what we're doing when we're hungering and thirsting for righteousness is we're hungering and thirsting for God. We're hungering and thirsting for our God self, what some would describe as our true self. And so that's really what righteousness is. It's like, I'm not trying to earn God's approval. I'm not trying to earn God's favor. I'm responding to the love and the presence that are already there. And if you don't have that starting point with the journey, if you don't understand that, then you really have this sense that I never measure up. I'm never good enough. It leads to self-rejection, really, and that's devastating. So I just find that whole idea from Merton very helpful, and it does give us a helpful way of understanding righteousness, because, of course, righteousness, it does, it evokes a sense of things we need to do, right? I mean, when you hear the word righteousness, I hear it,
right.
Things we need to do. And I think really what righteousness is about a response to something that already is.
I want to linger on hunger and thirst for a moment before we move on. And this came up in my Sunday school class on last Sunday. And hunger and thirst today is not the same thing as hunger and thirst back in the day.
Right.
When I'm hungry, that just means I haven't eaten since lunch and I'm hungry for dinner. When those folks were hungry, and many of them, that meant that they didn't know where their next meal was coming from.
Right.
I don't believe I've ever truly been hungry.
Not in that way.
In that way. I've never been thirsty in that way. I open the tap and fresh, clean water comes out of it. That was not automatic for those folks. So that just makes the point. Blessed are those who hunger, really, really deeply hunger and thirst for righteousness, and they're going to be filled.
Well, I mean, to build on that, the folks that Jesus would have been teaching and talking to, they likely, if they did not get another meal, some of them very well could die.
Right.
I mean, it was that serious. And so in that context, once you understand, it's a great point, Randy, like this is like, I have to have this.
Desperate for
to
it.
live, and I'm desperate.
Yeah.
It's a good point. That certainly that's what Jesus is getting at here.
Yeah. Okay, so once again, I'm going to ask you to paint a word picture because we're not looking at the window, but describe what the window looks like in the sanctuary that describes this beatitude.
Okay, well, at the bottom of the stained glass window in the sanctuary, there are four. Excuse me. There are four people kind of looking up to heaven, and it depicts them drinking. They're drinking from like a vase or something, and there's water. And so that's the thirsting portion that we were just talking about. As you move up the window, though, there's another individual that's kind of like made it up in terms of spiritual journey, and they're reaching up now toward a breastplate of righteousness, like an armor, a sword, which is the sword of truth, and then there's these scales of justice. And so if you put it together, what's the windows trying to convey? Well, as a people of faith, as followers of Jesus, we're called to hunger and thirst for the right sort of things. And what are the right sort of things? Well, to put it simply, it's about justice, right? We want goodness. We want the right thing. And so that's what the window's kind of doing.
Mm-hmm. You use two stories from the Bible to illustrate this, one from baptism, in particular the baptism of Jesus, and then the story of Joseph, the husband of Mary.
Yeah. So Jesus' baptism, it's a famous moment in his life, of course. He goes to the river, gets baptized. As he comes up out of the water, the Gospels they each tell the story a little bit differently, but basically what happens is there's a voice that says, Jesus, you're my beloved, with you I'm well pleased. Of course, that's the voice of God. Now, I think probably in that moment what happens for Jesus is he realizes his identity and his mission. You know, he was already these things before he got there, but he realizes it in that moment. And that is something important for us to understand. Back to the Thomas Merton conversation, we are also the beloved of God. As a baptized people, we've claimed that identity, and that's really the foundation of what we're talking about. When we talk about righteousness, hey, I'm someone that God cares about. I'm someone that God loves. To even push the envelope a little more, by virtue of being created, we're loved. God loved us into existence. And so that's the foundation here of the first half of the coin I'll call righteousness is you're already beloved, right? That's who you are. Now, in Joseph, though, we have a story about what it looks like to live into that and practice it ethically in our lives. And of all the stories in the Gospels, Joseph might be one of my favorite because, well, number one, I'm a father, and of course, Joseph is Jesus' earthly father. And the story is, of course, Joseph is engaged to Mary. She gets pregnant by someone else. And the custom of the time was that if this would happen, then that would break off the engagement. He would report her to the authorities, and that also included religious authorities. And in response to that, the religious authorities, they would likely probably stone her to death. So it was like a capital offense. And we don't need to go into all this, but in the Hebrew Bible, there are commandments, the Old Testament, there are commandments that kind of lay it out. Yeah, that's what you do. Well, the interesting thing about Joseph is he decides to break the rules. He decides to break the norms. And Matthew tells us because he's a righteous man, he does these things. And here we have a vivid picture of righteousness. What is it? Well, it's not keeping the rules. It's not keeping the expectations. It's about putting human need first. And so Joseph puts Mary first. He decides he's going to dismiss her quietly to save her life. And because of that, he saves not only Mary's life, Jesus' life, and Christ is born.
Right.
I mean, it's so vivid. And that's what it means to me to be a follower of Jesus. I'm going to put the needs of others first. I'm going to put human need first. I'm not going to get all caught up with being legalistic in my interpretation of the Bible. I'm not going to get all caught up with being, bullied into doing what the culture tells me to do. I'm called to put the human need of the person in front of me first, because I believe that's how Christ is born into the world. Now, my belovedness, to use the phrase from before, affirms the belovedness of another. That's it. That's righteousness. That's what it looks like. And I think deep down we know that to be already true, but it's good to be reminded for sure.
Yeah, often. As you were talking about Mary getting pregnant by someone else and the punishment could be being stoned to death, I thought about this. I'm sure I'm not the first one to think about it, but this is the first time I've thought about it. I thought about that story in the Gospel of John where there's the woman caught in adultery, and Jesus says, write something in the ground. That's interesting because he never wrote anything, right? So he wrote, that may have been the only thing that we've ever heard that he's written. An interesting question, what did he write? Maybe he wrote mother. I mean, maybe he thought about his mother in that moment when he said, he who is without sin, without sin, cast the first stone. Go and sin no more. Yeah.
A merciful attitude.
Yeah.
That's what it means to be a Christ follower, to have Christ. We talk about having Christ in our heart. What's that mean? Well, I have a merciful heart, and that leads me to treat people accordingly. One of the best criticisms I ever got, and I take it. I love this story because I had a professor who said, Andy, I'm really concerned that you're going to fault on the side of grace. And I said, thank you. Because if I'm going to fault, I want to fault on the side of grace. I don't want to fault on the side of dogmatics or legalism or all these things that religion has a way of doing to people. No. I want to fault on the side of grace. Joseph faults on the side of grace. Christ is born. Jesus clearly, again and again, faults on the side of grace and calls us to do the same.
Yeah, very good. And so from there, you said that we lean into this, and if we do this, and then it creates ripples and waves, and it creates change. And you listed some examples from the life of our church right now.
One of the things I try to do in a lot of my sermons is I call it preach my announcements or preach our announcements, and I want to celebrate people in our life of our church, and remind them these are ways that we are being faithful. And so I talked about our monthly ministry spotlight, the Ronald McDonald House, and so every month at Methodist Temple we always talk about one of the organizations we support as a church, and this past month has been the McDonald House, the Ronald McDonald House. And of course what they do is they create a space for families to stay while their kiddos are in the hospital. It's a really great organization. And so when we talked about it, when we showed the video in worship, people were so interested that we decided to actually arrange a tour of the facility, and now there's 8 people going to sign up for a meal there. I just love that. Another story I told was about an elderly member of our congregation, one of the real saints of our church, Phil Kinsey is his name. Phil's 93 years old, joined the church in the 1960s. He's a wonderful soul. Most Sunday mornings when he comes up to me, he says, Pastor Andy, I'm praying for you, praying that your faith would grow, praying that you would have the good sense to balance ministry with your family. He says all the right stuff,
right?
And anyway, Phil asked our youth director, Ryan, if he could share with the youth one Sunday morning for Sunday school. And Ryan made it happen. And so I showed some pictures of Phil sitting with the teenagers, and they were just so engaged with Phil and his authenticity as he told his story about his life, about the challenges he went through, about his faith. I asked Phil how it went, and he said it went pretty good because, number one, they listened, and number two, they laughed at my jokes. And that's usually the 2 gauges for a good sermon too, right? They listened and they laughed at my jokes. But and I asked Ryan also, our youth director, I said, so what was the most impactful moment for you? And he said at the end when he prayed for the kids, the youth. And in his life, in that moment, his life serves as such a powerful reminder of what it looks like to grow old with grace and wisdom. And that's one of the gifts of being a part of a congregation like Methodist Temple, where we truly are intergenerational. And so you have some folks like Phil Kinsey that in his humility and his willingness calls forth the best out of all of us, right? And I don't know. I hope I'm giving him justice because Phil is just a wonderful, wonderful person.
I gravitate toward him. They sit up in the front row. It's not the front row. No one sits in the front row. They sit in the second row. But I gravitate toward him because I know I'm going to get a word. Selfishly, I know I'm going to get a word of encouragement.
Yeah. Yes. In a world that is so critical, in a world that is ready to pounce on every last little word you say wrong or something you didn't do right and just boom. Phil Kinsey is grace. He's a Christ follower in the way that he carries himself in his spirit. Yes. And so, you reach out, you kind of lift up these stories and like, this is what it looks like. We can talk about the Bible all day long. We talk about Jesus too, but this is a concrete example.
This is a living example.
Yeah.
He's in my Sunday school class. In fact, after the first couple of weeks that I started teaching it, he ended up sitting right next to me and real close to me because Phil has hearing issues and he can't hear. So he wants to hear. So he sits right next to me, almost like he's the co-teacher. He doesn't say much, but he wants to listen.
Yeah.
He wants to take it all in. You also mentioned we had our Temple Hills outing this spring. That's the campground we have up in Pike County, and the dedication of the trees there is another example.
Yeah. So Methodist Temple owns its own campground up in Pike County, and one of the things we do is in the spring and the fall, we always have a kind of like a Temple Hills picnic, really. And this year, we dedicated 3 trees in memory of some people who have impacted our lives. Their lives are like trees that have been planted in our lives, and they continue to grow. And so it was really neat to be able to do that. We recognized one of the former caretakers with the tree. We recognized the current caretakers with the tree. And then we also recognized some of the Patbergs, really. They're former members of Methodist Temple. They've graduated to heaven now at this point. And so we dedicated a tree to them as well. And it's just, it's nice to honor people in that way. And so it was a great time to be together as well.
Good. Well, without using the word, we're talking about love, right? And you quoted, did I write this down? Thomas Ward, is that correct?
Ord. It's O-O-R-D. Ord.
Ord.
Yeah, my mom had the same problem. She goes, now, what does his last name start with? I was like, it's Ord, O-O-R-D. No, I missed it. And it's like, no, Mom, this is it. But no, Thomas Ord is one of the new people I've come across in the last few months. He's a theologian from the Nazarene denomination, which is a cousin of the United Methodist Church. We have the same roots, just different denominations, really, but same tradition, basically. And Ord is, I guess one way to describe his theology, he's a relational type of theologian, and we don't have to get into all that in our podcast unless you want to, of course. But he has this great definition of love. He says to love is to act intentionally in response to God and others to promote well-being, or to say it another way, to promote another person's happiness. Let me say that again. To love is to act intentionally. It involves something we do consciously, and it's in response. Love is never a vacuum, right? Like we don't just sit and love, we respond concretely he writes, to God and others to promote well-being. Now, one of the things in my sermon I wasn't able to get into is like, wait a minute. So you respond to God for God's well-being? That's not typically how we think about God, right? Mm-hmm. And if you really take seriously the scriptures, yeah, God likes some of the things we do, and God does not like some of the things we do. And so to live as a person of faith means you're responding for God's well-being. And and I just find that to be a very helpful way of thinking about love. A lot of times when we think about love, it's like an attitude, it's a feeling. What Ord is saying is it's a concrete something we do, actually an act. We consciously choose these kinds of things.
And something we did as a denomination, the United Methodist Church at the General Conference last week, responded to a certain community of people.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this for a while at Methodist Temple. You cannot be in the United Methodist Church and not know about this. I don't think you can anyway. And so Our General Conference met last week, which is the highest legislative body of the United Methodist Church. They basically come up with the church law and policy, and they decided collectively to get rid of the ban on openly gay clergy and get rid of it was a long-term ban on pastors performing same-sex wedding ceremonies. And so those two bans are gone as a result of the General Conference. And in my sermon, I talked a little bit about how, look, I understand. Some people are going to say, boy, that went way too far. They're not okay with that. On the other side, I've heard other people say it did not go far enough. That ruling does not necessarily limit discrimination in the life of the church, because a pastor can still decide not to do a wedding ceremony that they don't want to do. That ruling that they came up with in General Conference does not force a pastor or a church to do ceremonies they don't want to do. And so some people would say it didn't go far enough. I, for one, I celebrate it.
Me too.
I said it in the sermon. I celebrate it. And I feel like it's long overdue. I feel like we as a church, it is time for us to allow one another to follow our conscience without fear of retribution or retaliation. And I don't think we're out of the forest yet, because the ruling just happened. And so it's going to mean some congregations are going to have to navigate some difficult, kind of meetings and stuff. But here at Methodist Temple, people are pretty excited about this. I think we're ready to be more officially inclusive church. Here we've been inclusive really for about 4 or 5 years, but what this ruling does is basically say, okay, Methodist Temple, you can be who you already are. Back to Thomas Merton again. You can be who you said you're going to be. And
you said for us it was really anticlimactic.
Yeah, and I found that to be odd for me, Randy. Because it's been a long 5 years, and even beyond that. I mean, this goes back to 1972 in the Methodist Church, but 2019 was a pivotal General Conference because things really blew up in our denomination at that point. No need to rehearse all the details of that, but so we've been waiting since 2019 for General Conference to meet again and make these rulings. And so, it's been a long road, but for me, I guess, I don't know. I don't know what I expected I was going to feel after this was over. And I read about it in the news and I felt like, okay, yeah, all right. I was relieved, I guess, in a sense. But the funny thing was, unlike 2019, I had no one showing up at my office angry. I had no one calling the phone, the church office and be like, hey, I got to talk to you about this, or I haven't gotten an angry email yet, really. And that wasn't always the case for me. Some people get very passionate about this, and they're uncomfortable with us being inclusive like we are. I get it, but I got none of that this week. I got none of that last week. It was a quiet week in the office for us, which really tells me where our church kind of is. I mean, I realize not everyone in the congregation is going to be yay raw about this decision, but we know who we are already, and I celebrate that too.
And there should be a difference. It will make a difference, but the point I want to make is when we gather together next Sunday, you won't see any difference. We're going to keep on doing what we've been doing and being who we have been.
Yeah, we're going to be who we are at our congregation. And this is maybe one of the most important things I've ever done as a leader in the church. About 7 or 8 years ago, we got together and we basically decided what are the values that are going to define us as a community. That's what made this so easy, this whole transition for us as a congregation. And we said we wanted to strive to be a safe, a non-judgmental community that seeks to see Christ in every person and affirm the sacred value of every single person. And I think that's really what helped us to navigate all of this. Because when people come to a church, let's just be honest, they want to know what kind of church they're going to be a part of. What is this community going to be like? What are the values that are going to guide this community? People get hurt at church all the time. And so that's been a powerful way to navigate this wilderness we've been through, because we've said this is who we are, and we're going to become who we already are, and we're going to try to live into that.
You said something Sunday that I said, similar to something that I said in 2019. during that special called General Conference when this really came up in a very, very powerful way, and the language was even made more strict. But you said something, this is paraphrased, but you said that you want to bring people in and not keep people out. And that's what I said to my congregation back in 2019. I said, I didn't go into this to keep people out of the church. I went into it to bring people into the church.
Right.
And so I had a situation. I don't want to out anybody, but after I shared my heart and what I thought about this issue back in 2019, I had someone come to me and say, thank you. I cried myself to sleep over what the church said about me.
Oh, my gosh.
Night after night after night. But kept going to church because this
hungered,
person wanted to be.
They hungered and thirst for righteousness.
There you go.
They hungered for God.
There you go.
The people from the gay community that have stuck around and stuck it out with the church are extraordinary saints. The grace that they have shown us. Holy cow.
You can learn a thing or two, right?
Yes. I mean, you talk about someone who's practicing the good news of God's unconditional love. It's a person who basically is being told, you're less than because of who you are. And they're saying, no, I'm not. And I'm going to continue to love you anyway. And some of the gay folks that I've known in the life of the church, tremendous in the way that they've embodied the faith. They inspire me, really have. And, that's one of the reasons I've been so vocal about it. I don't want to be up in people's faces about this particular conversation. In fact, I'm ready for it not to take the air out of the room all the time because it has in some ways been a distraction, but I cannot dismiss these signs of God's love in these people, though, either.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to transition into the way you concluded the sermon, and I also don't want to push you beyond where you want to go on that issue. But if you're ready to move on, we'll move on.
Well, I mean, if you got any questions, Randy, you can ask them. This is our moment. But I think everyone listening to podcasts kind of knows where we're at, though.
Right.
Yeah.
It's been no secret. Yeah. But the fact that it became official, in fact, it became official Friday.
Was it? Yeah. Okay.
When the conference ended,
it's done.
Those things were done. Mm-hmm. Now, if we're going to get into, and we don't really need to, if we're going to get into the whole regional issue, those have to be ratified by the annual conferences, right? That's another whole thing. But
yeah. The big news is we're free to follow our conscience and to do what we believe God's called us to do, and I think that's good news for sure.
All right. So as you wrapped up this sermon. You just noted the wars that are raging right now and the protests that are going on as a result of the wars and what is and was going on in the denomination. And there is this election that's going on. And you said that we can't allow these things to force us to forget who we are.
Did I say that?
You did.
Oh. Well, yeah, I agree. No, that's so true though, right? Like, I read something Henry Nouwen once said where the call of the disciple is not to get tangled up with the things from below, but to think from above. And what he means by that is not that we don't care about what's happening in the world, but we have to remember who we are, who we're sustained by, and in the end, where we're going. And so often that doesn't happen, right? We get all tangled up in, did it happen the way I wanted it to, or I'm worried about this or that. And to be a child of God means, hey, I know where I came from, I know where I'm going, and I have just a little time here to embody that love. And so that's the righteous life, really. That's what I'm hungry. That's what we hunger and thirst for. Yep.
All right. In the last minute or so, a little preview of this Sunday.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, like you said before, the Beatitudes they're like their own message together, but then they kind of make their own points as well. And so next Sunday is, blessed are those that are merciful, for they will receive mercy. And of course, like, mercy is a big part of the gospel. Forgiveness and these kinds of things are a key point that Jesus makes again and again. But another way to think about it really is, blessed are they who really care for it is in caring you'll find that which you're looking for. And really the mercy Jesus is talking about here is much more than just an attitude. This kind of goes with what we've already talked about today in our podcast, but it's much more than just an attitude. The mercy Jesus calls us to is to take action as a result. And we really care, we take action. And in fact, in the life of the Christian tradition, we have what we call works of mercy. And they're concrete actions that we're called to take as Christians. And it's in practicing these things that we find the spiritual vibe that we're looking for, to use, I guess, some more modern language. So, yeah, I kind of look forward to delving into that and talking about how Jesus was all about mercy. And in fact, he says a couple times in Matthew's gospel, know what this means. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. It's good stuff.
All right. We are the beloved, and the goal is to become who we already are. Hey, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. Your time is important, and it's in short supply. And so we appreciate you taking the time out to listen to what we have to say. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.